I'm Devin Jefferson, the community science catalyst here at the Science Museum. And I know a lot of you may know a little bit about RVAir already, but I just wanted to set the tone. I'm going to be going over some background information about RVAir, what it is, and why we're doing it. And then, jump right into why we're here and start to talk a little bit about some of the data we've been collecting so far. So that we can get a little bit better with interpreting that data as a collective, as a community. We're here because of a grant that the Science Museum received through IMLS, which is the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So that funding has given us an opportunity to study the air quality of Richmond. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen, and I'll get to show you guys some of the ways we've been able to communicate the information and share this information so far. RVAir. We're talking about Richmond's air quality, and a little bit of background of why we're talking about this in the first place. There are a lot of things going on in our environments that we don't always notice or immediately. And one of those things is the air, because it's something we don't really think about a lot. If you think about the things that you interact with, the things that affect your health, sometimes people think about things like pollen, dust, and their allergies, and those are really good things to point to. But there's a lot more to our air quality and the things that we breathe in than just things like pollen, dust, etc. And as a bit of an example to show how important that invisible stuff is. Just some context, Richmond is often, it's usually toward the top of this list, but recently it has been named the second sneeziest, wheeziest city in America. And that's because there's a high rate of asthma diagnoses, and we know, as people who may, at least for me, I've lived in Richmond for most of my life, born and raised, and the allergies here are rough. That's another reason that Richmond is often considered one of the sneeziest and wheeziest cities. So I have asthma and allergies, so it's great for me, especially in the spring and summer when things get really fun. And also, honestly, the fall when you have like the mold and all these other allergens that are starting to pop up. Richmond is a sweet spot for that, whether you want it to be or not. So that topic definitely comes up a lot. The topic of air quality, the topic of things that we breathe. But that being said, Richmond overall has good air quality as a region. And one of the reasons we know that is because some of our partners some of our program partners, like our friends at the DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, they have some very high quality sensors that help make those estimates and help us see those trends, to see that air quality has gotten better over time, but we still have some perplexing situations like this, where Richmond is still one of the sneeziest and wheeziest cities. So getting into that, what makes a city, or what makes the air quality bad, good, indifferent? What's in it that we're even talking about in the first place? And when we're talking about air quality, we're talking about particulate matter specifically. Or in our context, we're talking about particulate matter. That's what we're measuring. Particulate matter, PM, is what you'll hear me say a lot. PM 2.5 to be specific. But it's a mixture that includes organic and inorganic particles in the air that we breathe in. They affect how well we breathe, and as well as have those cascading effects for our health. The size of the things that we're talking about. We're talking about things that are really, really tiny. So 2.5 in the PM 2.5 that you see here in this graphic refers to microns in diameter, as you see. Micron, really, really small, about 100 times smaller than that millimeter. And for reference with the human hair, the average human hair is between 50 and 70 microns in diameter. So when we're talking about these particulate matter, we're talking about things that are way smaller than than the hairs on our heads. And we kind of need some cool equipment to help us measure those levels of particulate matter that we might be breathing in the form of dust, smoke, things like that. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those extreme examples in a few minutes. But at the end of the day, one of the reasons we're talking about this is because we already know that PM 2.5, long-term exposures to high levels of PM 2.5 are often associated with high rates of, are often associated with asthma, other cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses. That's where we're talking about that long-term exposure. And so some of the context that we're also looking at this information, this is just a quick little graphic to show as we're looking at air quality, we're also looking at other environmental factors. Some of those environmental factors can be tree canopy cover. You see down here in the bottom center image, tree canopy cover is just how much cover there is with trees. In this particular image, we're looking at toward the center of Richmond City, and that's where all three of these circles are highlighting. They're highlighting around the same place on this map of Richmond, and we can see that there's an interesting intersection where there is a higher rate of asthma in the communities or in the areas of Richmond where there is lower tree canopy cover in this instance. And this is the trend. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but this is what a lot of what we've been seeing so far. And those environments that have high rates of asthma and have lower tree canopy cover sometimes also have high level or high concentrations of impervious or paved surfaces. And so we see that that's probably not an accident, or we can interpret, we can gather as we talk to as we gather more and more data, we can be more reasonably certain that that's not a random coincidence, at least. But then the question becomes, how much do these factors really play into our health or our air quality? That's some of the things that we hope to get at with the data that we're gathering, and that's where everyone comes in. As community scientists, which we'll get to in a minute. This is a quick map that I'll show. We'll come back to it later, but this is an interactive map with the RVAir, the RVAir network, and I just wanted to show you this to get an idea of what some of these monitors look like and what some of the information that we're looking at is presented as. So these are individual RVAir sensors that are mounted at people's businesses, homes, program partners, like for example, the Boys and Girls Club. There's one at the Valentine Museum that is not reporting just yet, but that is okay. And we do have one at the Science Museum as well. I just wanted to show you what that looks like. And we'll come back to how we interact with some of this data in minutes. But I also wanted to show you just one of the other ways that we are looking at this PM 2.5 data. Specifically, and these are things that when we're starting to get into talking about how we interpret this data, sometimes we have maps like this, or we have data representations that look like this. I'm just showing you this to say, hey, this is another way that we can look at this data, and it's correlated by saying where there's red, those are higher concentrations of PM 2.5 for the times that we collected this data. Where it's green, those are lower levels of PM 2.5, and green, and these levels correspond to the EPA guidelines of concentrations for particulate matter in the air. And whether that's green means good, yellow is not so good. You probably shouldn't be outside for too long, especially if you're in a sensitive group like me who has asthma. Or if you're elderly, or if you're really young, you already have some pre-existing conditions that might make it a little hard to be outside for a long period of time during those times when there's a lot of particulate matter in the air. These are maps. These are ways of visualizing that data that can kind of help people make sense of what we're doing, what we're looking at. But getting ahead of myself, because we need to figure out what we can do to understand more about that. And that's where we come in with community science. Community science being a really, really good tool that we can utilize to, like I said, get people, number one, on the same page about what particulate matter is, about what air quality is. And then also community science is a great tool a great collaboration tool that gets people involved, so that people can have that hands-on experience with whatever topic it is. It doesn't have to be air quality all the time, but we can go out into our communities, we can collect data ourselves, and then we can have gatherings, we can have events like this where we then talk about that data. I went over this a little bit earlier, but what exactly is RVAir? It's a community science program aimed at using the community, leveraging the community's expertise to ask important questions, to research those important questions, and then say, at the end of the day, what can we do about it? Ideally, those the solutions that are developed are community-led, community-inspired, and then can be implemented by the community leaders, individual members who are passionate about it, things like that. What we've been doing to collect this data, we've had two different methods of collecting this air quality data. One is using the Purple Air Network, which I showed you a little while ago. It's these little white sensors that are really easy to install, and they sit there. All they need is a power source and a Wi-Fi connection, and they're running 24/7, constantly collecting that air quality data, that PM 2.5 concentration. And the way it does that, just like with the mobile sensors that we're talking about, with these AirBeam 2.5, the AirBeam 2s, which I'll talk in more detail about in a few minutes. We've been using both sensors to collect that data. The difference being the Purple Air sensor up here is stationary. The AirBeam sensor right here is our mobile sensor. So we've been able to use these to walk around and create some of the maps that you were seeing up above. The big map of Richmond, where there were lots of lines everywhere with the dots on it. All that information was collected by our community efforts to measure PM 2.5 levels during an extreme heat event, as an example. But they basically have a little sensor, a little sensor inside with a laser that is counting particulate matter as it comes through that laser, and it's sorted by size. And we'll see a little bit about what that looks like on the AirCasting website in a few minutes. We'll go through that. Here we come to talk about what we're learning so far. I'll just show this really quickly to give you a quick visual of the AirCasting website, but we're actually going to go onto the AirCasting website and play around a little bit in a minute. So just as a quick reference, the AirCasting website looks a little bit like this. These are two different screenshots that are put side by side. But this data is overlaid onto a map. Like we were seeing earlier, the colors correspond to things that are to levels that are good, bad, in between. And they're put onto a map. They're tagged to, or they're connected to a location as we're walking around with our little ghost emojis, collecting that that air quality data. And so these right here are averages. We'll see in a minute what those numbers look like specifically. But I just wanted to show you, this is the visual that we're working with, and this is one of the ways that we are able to interpret the data we're collecting. That's I just wanted to run through those few images really quickly, and also just kind of show you some highlights of things that we've done so far, and ways that we've been able to go out into the community. I think this was, I forgot, this is one of the trails, North Bank Trail, I believe, is where we were here. And over by Maymont Park, at the Visitor Center, the Nature Center, things like that is where we go. We have people that are out here riding their bikes. Lots of ways to participate for RVAir. There have been a lot of people who have had some questions about what RVAir means for them specifically, and how air quality affects them. One of the ways one of the topics of conversation that's come up recently is the code orange that we had for Richmond, maybe 2 months ago at this point. Does anybody remember hearing about that code orange for air quality, or even know what a code orange is when it refers to air quality? Yeah. So someone asked, does it mean we should stay indoors? Yes. Basically, it is a warning that's issued. In this case, it was issued by the Department of Environmental Quality because their sensors picked up a high enough concentration of particulate matter from the wildfires actually out on the west coast of the U.S. earlier this year. So if you remember, there were some wildfires that were taking place and from British Columbia, Canada, all the way down to California, Nevada, that area, the wildfires that are becoming more frequent, unfortunately. The smoke, the debris from those wildfires, there was so much of it that was going high enough up into the atmosphere that it was basically able to travel, ride that airstream, the normal airstreams that are always around, that are always moving, circulating the air on our planet. It was able to ride that air current all the way over to the West Coast. And because at the time, Richmond, as we all know, or as I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with, Richmond has that great combination of heat and humidity. And that was one of the big factors that allowed that smoke, that debris to settle over Richmond. If you remember, there was some haze. There were a couple of days where there were some really pretty sunsets. I know a lot of people got some really good pictures, but sorry to say, it was a large part of that was caused by the smoke, the byproduct of the wildfires on the West Coast. Now that showed up, and that impacted us as a code orange. And what that means is that the levels of PM 2.5 specifically were high enough for an average over the course of that day that people should be avoiding, doing work outside for 6-7 hours a day if you can avoid that situation. For someone like me, it means that even though we were doing some RVAir walks around that time, it meant that I needed to be more mindful about whether I need to use my inhaler for that day if I'm going to be outside for an extended period of time, or for the people who are coming to participate in RVAir, being mindful of not keeping people either outside or rescheduling if the case turned into that. So that's just a little bit of context for some of the ways that this information, like air quality, can be utilized to help us in our daily lives and act accordingly. We're getting to that part of RVAir where we've collected a lot of data. We've had a lot of conversations. Now we want to have that conversation to make sure everyone understands the data that we're seeing and knows how to interpret it and knows how to have a conversation about it, so that we can have those solutions that are community-based, community-led. So the first thing that I do is I'm going to center over the Science Museum here. I just happen to already know where the Science Museum is. Okay, so now that we have the Science Museum in the center of our view, we're going to make sure that we're in the right settings. So the default for this website is always particulate matter, but if you really want to, on the left-hand side, you can change to look at other settings because these devices record temperature, relative humidity, and sound if you set it up that way, as well as 3 sizes for particulate matter. If you ever wanted to look at other sizes for particulate matter, like PM10 or PM1, those options are here as well. But we're talking about PM 2.5 because that's the size that is most often associated, like we said, with air pollution and the long-term health impacts of air pollution. We can also adjust the time frame that we're looking at. So you can go over here and say, well, I just want to look at one specific week or one specific day. You can do that as well. The default for this calendar is always the past calendar year, the past 365 days, I guess I should say. But I'm going to turn on the crowd map. So down here at the bottom, you have the option to turn on the crowd map, and that will give you much more detail. It'll show you all the places that people using the AirBeam 2.5s or the AirBeam 2s have gone in whatever area you happen to be looking at. So here we're at the Science Museum. I'm actually going to change this to the satellite view, help people their bearings. And we have the Science Museum right here. So, like I said, for the most part, Richmond has pretty good air quality overall. These dots kind of back that up, but you can also see that there's some areas where it's not so great. These are trends. These are patterns that we want to help people notice. We want to help people talk about, and maybe ask some more digging questions as to why Hermitage Road is on average has a higher PM 2.5 reading than maybe over here in front of the Science Museum on Broad Street. But before we get into all of that, just want to bring your attention to the bottom of the screen. Mine is blocking it. But at the bottom of the screen, there is a scale that is adjustable, but the default for that scale is aligned with the EPA's readings the EPA's thresholds for green, yellow, red, etc. And green in this case is anything 12 micrograms per cubic meter or less will show up as green. Anything that is, see it's blocked on mine, but I think it's 35 micrograms per cubic meter or less is orange, and et cetera, et cetera. What you're seeing here are averages, by the way, just to make sure we're all on the same page. These squares are showing us averages of readings that were taken in that location. So if you click on any of these little squares, it'll tell you the average reading for this specific location. So if we wanted to look at this random, this intersection here at Robinson and Grace, we could take a look at that. And as my computer's thinking, it says the average reading for this little intersection is 13 micrograms per cubic meter for PM 2.5. There's only one contributor because all of the accounts were under mine, but there have been 8 measurements taken for that specific location. So that just means that we can probably have a few more measurements to make sure we're getting an accurate reading of what that area really has going on. But so far, it's been a higher average than the area right around it. And that's important to note because what we've been able to notice so far is that these intersections tend to be a little bit more elevated with PM 2.5 than the roads, than the long stretches of the roads. There could be a few reasons for that. One of the reasons that comes to my mind, and has come to the minds of others that as we've been having these conversations, is that, well, it's an intersection. People are stopping at traffic lights a little bit more, or stop signs, more than they are when they're just driving. So as a car sitting there idling, probably the exhaust the exhaust from cars being a big source of PM 2.5 is probably contributing to this higher average. Let me see, a place that I like to point out overall. So I usually point out this little spot right here across from the museum. And it's actually not showing up as much as I thought it was going to recently. I know we haven't been over there to collect data as much, but this restaurant right here, this is a restaurant. For those of you who don't know, it is called Chicken Fiesta. I like this place a little too much. I go there fairly regularly, but it is delicious. I know some other people can confirm. Usually, this area around here has a few more yellow and orangish looking squares than green. But I was curious if anybody in this call has an idea as to why that area usually has higher readings of PM 2.5. Any ideas as to why there might be more PM 2.5 in that area? Most of that is the smoke from the grill. They have a big old rotisserie inside as they're cooking the chicken, as they're probably doing right now. And usually, if the conditions are right, you can see there's kind of a haze actually around the building from all of that smoke. So I point that out to say that sometimes as we're collecting this data, we might get some readings that are unexpected. But it's important to then take a step back, have a conversation, or at least ask a follow-up question as to why, what else was going on in the environment to cause that reading to be elevated. In this case, we're reasonably certain it's the restaurant because it's also visible that we can see the haze around that restaurant. But we have some other areas, like over here in the walkway for the Science Museum that leads over to the parking lot. The average particulate matter reading is a little bit higher, and that's something that is I've had questions about that. I'm looking into it. So we do know that things like humidity play a really big role in these PM 2.5 readings, as well as air quality as a topic in general. Humidity tends to make the particulate matter in the air do something that we call flocculate. Basically, it makes those particles stick together a little bit more than they normally do. And as those particles stick together in the air, well, they then show up a little bit more easily on our devices, whether they're showing up as PM 10 or as higher readings of PM 2.5. That's just one factor that can affect air quality and these readings. And green spaces tend to be more humid because they have more plant life that is actually helping with that process. So it's a good question to ask as to why is this elevated? And if we know why, what can we do about it? That's where those next steps, that's where the follow-up steps for our conversations come into play. To say, well, if we can do something about it, what can we do, and who can help, who will benefit? All of those are very important follow-up questions that we have that we talk about. What I wanted to show overall, though, one of the views that I wanted to show was the big picture view of Richmond, because this is a community science effort. Remember, this isn't just me running around Richmond with my little ghost emoji by myself. This is a very large effort with a lot of people involved. So we've had over 500 recorded sessions with RVAir, which is awesome. We've had well over 200 volunteers in various capacities contribute to this data as well. But I wanted to really be able to show you the scale that this project has been able to investigate, to look at. And this is a pretty big view of Richmond. We've had, we haven't filled it out completely. It's not totally filled out, but compared to where we started to where we were last year, which was mostly just around the Science Museum collecting data, just because that was what we had available to us, we have come a very, very long way as a group, as an effort, because now we can start to see some pretty interesting trends of where air quality is a little bit more precarious on average, or where PM 2.5 readings are a little bit more precarious and where they're not. So kind of like when one of the maps that we were showing earlier, now that we have information, a little bit more data on this scale, then we can start to look at other environmental factors, other environmental pieces that could come into play, or whether they're environmental factors or other things in general. There could be plenty of things to talk about in relation to air quality. Before I leave this screen, let me show you just one other thing. If you happen to click on one of these specific squares here at the bottom, what you'll see is that it'll take you into a specific session, a specific route. Okay, so this is a specific walk that we did in collaboration with RVAgreen 2050, and which well, I'll give them a shout out in a minute because they've been a very important program partner, especially lately. We've had a couple of walks with them. One of them was in the Jackson Ward area of Richmond, over by the Black History Museum on Lee Street. And what these individual views will show is they'll track. You can see the blue dot as I move along this graph. That blue dot is showing where in space this data was taken. So it's really cool. It gets to follow in real time. One other thing that you can do is in the bottom right-hand corner of this screen, what you can do is hit this button, this vertical, the button with vertical lines on it, or vertical arrows. And this essentially standardizes the data just for that one walk. So it puts it into the context of what was the minimum recording or the minimum reading for PM 2.5 for that walk, and the maximum, and then the average. So instead of just looking at the big 0 to 150 scale, it makes it a 3 to 11, 3 micrograms per cubic meter to 11 micrograms per cubic meter. And now it looks a little bit more interesting. Now this data means probably a little bit more, because we can tell, well, now it's not all just green, right? Now we can have a much more detailed view of the data that we've been getting. So, for example, what we'll see here is that, well, for some reason, the park is in this walk, as well as others that we took. I think we had about eight readings, or about 8 sensors that were walking around at the same time. Now, this is just one sensor's data, but all of the sensors that did this walk showed that when we were walking through the park, there was some unexpectedly higher readings of PM 2.5 than we really were planning on. It was unexpected, unexpectedly high. That could be a couple of things. Sometimes when people are smoking, we're walking by people that were smoking a cigarette or something like that. The sensors are that sensitive that pick it up. But like I was saying earlier, humidity also comes into play. So that's a factor that we have to ask a couple of more questions about, which I am currently asking more questions to other experts and things like that, to see what other things we can be on the lookout for that can explain why the park, which is normally green spaces, are good ways to minimize or to mitigate the effects of air pollution, because that green space cleans the air. It functionally is cleaning that air, it's scrubbing it. But this seemed to have the opposite expected effect compared to the rest of the data that we see on the walk. So why is that? Don't know yet, but chances are this intersection has a little bit to do with it. So that is just one example of ways that we are able to interpret data, and then make sure that we are discussing why we're seeing the things that we're seeing, put it hopefully into more explicit context. And then just a quick reminder, once you leave this view, if you get out of that specific view for one walk, you might be a little confused, because then all the other colors will have probably changed. All you need to do is go back down here and reset the scale. And there we go. So just as a quick reminder. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. There's a lot of things going on there. But what I wanted to kind of go back to was just to say, was that, talking about ways that things that we can do now that we have this information. That's honestly, if people have some ideas just based on what we've heard today, what we've heard so far, is there anyone who has already, maybe already have some knowledge about ways to address the issue of air quality or poor air quality in certain areas? I'll throw out one that I've referenced a couple of times. Investing in green space, green infrastructure is a good way to help with this. Does anybody else have ideas, suggestions, or other questions as we move on? I know we have roughly 15 minutes left.
Did you see any trends in the data when you're taking a reading close to like a drive-through restaurant? Does it vary like would say around lunchtime, would you expect to see higher particulate readings?
Yes. So we do expect to see higher readings during times like during those lunch rushes. Another example of that would be lunch supper over in Scott's Addition. Whenever they have their smoker going as they're preparing for the lunch rush or dinner rush, that area then has higher readings of particulate matter, especially for PM 2.5. That's just one of the more common byproducts of the smoker, things like that. Um, Places like Scott's Addition have also had some higher average PM 2.5 readings, partially because there's a lot of construction going on over there. If you've noticed, there's some big old high rises and some big apartment buildings that are going up, and the byproduct of that construction is, well, dirt, debris, dust that gets kicked up into the air, and that also contributes to those readings. And that's one of the things we hope to be able to show as change over time. The longer we are able to run this program, the more data we're able to collect, the better we're able to show that change over time. It could show that it's just that localized time period that's affected, or we could see that there are lingering effects, but that's a bigger picture question that we'll hopefully be able to address.
How immediate can solutions be implemented? So would we be talking like a immediate change, 5 years, 10 years?
That's a really good question. That's something we're definitely looking into, or I'm doing a little bit more research on, because so far it's been things like, or some of the more popular solutions that people have been talking about are things like investing in green infrastructure and green spaces. Now, creating a green space takes a little bit more effort. That's not something you can do necessarily in a week. But other things that might be more immediate are if there's ability to, for example, restrict as much traffic to an area, as much vehicle traffic to an area. That might not be something you can do in a day, as far as implementing that solution, but that is something that can have a quick impact. So a question that kind of similarly came from that was someone asked me if roundabouts, for example, were a way, or if roundabouts affected the levels of PM 2.5. And so far, what I've found is that roundabouts tend to lower the readings for PM 2.5 by between 20 and 40%. It's a wide range, but a significant range, a significant decrease nonetheless. And part of that is due to if you have a roundabout, chances are you're stopping less. And if you're stopping less, it means you have to accelerate a little bit less, or there's less time where cars are accelerating from 0 to hopefully under the speed limit or right at the speed limit. And that exhaust, is a source of particulate matter. The rubber, just the friction from the rubber of the tires, slowly shearing off into the air. Another source of PM 2.5 potentially.
Are there any companies that we're aware of in the area putting up rooftop gardens, or what other initiatives are going on to put green space in the area?
That's a good question. For example, we have this past weekend, we were doing some tree planting here at the Science Museum on our protopath. And that's the green. That's like the walking path that leads from just behind the museum over to Lee Street, kind of hugging around by the Washington football team's training camp. And that's an effort that's been going on for a little while. We've planted some new trees, and we had some help from Tree Lab, and who else? The Virginia, the League of Conservation Voters as well, have been good partners for, number one, getting the word out, but also being a part of initiatives like that. So planting trees is a is a good way to have some more immediate impact, and also get a little bit of workout in. But as we know, green spaces have lots of other positive impacts, not just with air quality, but hey, they're great to look at. They provide shade, they provide cooling effects, all of that good stuff. They help with biodiversity. The RVAgreen 2050 initiative is another important one, because they are Richmond's equity-based climate resilience initiative. So they've been doing a whole lot to get people more aware of not just air quality or challenges with air quality, but any other climate related issues. So they've been helping with park cleanups, or helping to organize park cleanups. Any organization that really does environmental efforts like that have been really good partners, or have been really good allies in that regard. But for us, RVAgreen 2050 has been a really big one, especially recently, as we've been able to kind of expand our influence and have more conversations about topics just like that.
All right. I don't see any other additional questions, so we'll go ahead and bring it to a close for today. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to Mr. Devin Jefferson, our community science catalyst, for helping us discover more about our world. Please join us next Wednesday, October 20th at noon, for Medicine and Vampires in Enlightenment Britain. That's going to be presented by Miss Nicole Salamone. She's an author and independent scholar. And this is definitely going to be one to look forward to. It's a great one for leading up to Halloween. You can register for next week's talk at smv.org. Each talk is free to attend and is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious.